Flight 587, the broken tail at the end of 9/11. The events surrounding Flight 587 are both tragic and terrifying. Just 2 months after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the United States would be plunged into another nightmare centered around aviation. The fear of another terrorist attack nearly shattered the nerves of an already traumatized nation. But the truth behind this horrific disaster was more technical than the actions of a madman holding a plane hostage. This time, the accident was preventable. So, without further ado, let's hear about the story of Flight 587. Normally, we'd start with the plane itself and the crew and passengers, but this time we need to take a look at the atmosphere of 2001 and the stark differences in procedure that's going to affect this entire set of circumstances that's about to go down. As most of you know, on 11th of September 2001, a major terrorist attack rocked the USA to its core. An organized quadruple operation took place when several al-Qaeda operatives took control of 4 passenger planes. 2 planes, filled with people held hostage at gunpoint, crashed into the Twin Towers. The 3rd plane slammed into the Pentagon, located in Virginia, and the 4th plane, originally headed for Washington, D.C., possibly towards the White House, never reached its destination. The passengers aboard Flight 93 fought the terrorists for control of the plane, leading to a total fatal crash in a field in Pennsylvania. Predictably, these horrific terrorist attacks threw the nation into a state of fear and a level of security that no American alive at the time had ever experienced before. But none more so than the airports. New measures were put in place to search every passenger and every bag twice. Pilots were tasked with checking the underside of their aircrafts manually for explosives. Bomb sniffer dogs were present at all times, and every flight was expected to depart at least an hour after schedule due to these strict security measures. Now, keep that in mind as we move on, because Flight 587 was in the middle of these harrowing and stressful conditions. Just 2 months after the multiple attacks on US citizens, she and her crew were expected to follow these new guidelines, and it was understandably stressful for everyone involved. The Airbus A300-B4-605R was 13 years old, and one of the first aircrafts brought over from Europe by American Airlines. In those 13 years, it had dutifully flown 37,000 hours in the air. It was built to accommodate 266 people, and on the 12th of November, it was booked to the brim with 251 passengers, as well as 9 crew members. The Airbus had a pretty uneventful record, with no major incidents or significant repairs outside of the regular maintenance and general replacement parts. She was flying just like she did 13 years ago, when she first took to the skies. Captain Edward States was the 42-year-old pilot who'd be taking the lead that day. He'd done even more time in the sky than the Airbus he was piloting. On record, he'd flown a whopping 37,550 hours in his lifetime. So, as you can imagine, a man with this much experience was considered at the top of his field. He was undoubtedly an exceptional pilot, too. His co-pilot was First Officer Stan Mullen, a 34-year-old who'd be flying almost the entirety of the flight. Mullen was gearing up to get his captain's stripes, and this was going to be one of the many flights that he'd be undertaking nearly all by himself, with a captain to oversee his performance. This is all pretty standard. Captain States had overseen many young pilots during his years as they climbed up through the ranks, just like he once had to. Mullen would not have reached this level of training if he had any serious problems behind a yoke. But Mullen had one training course that wasn't up to standard just yet, and that was training for the sensitivity on the rudder controls on an Airbus 300. Essentially, the rudder is a movable flap on the end of the tail that functions a lot like a rudder on a motorboat. It'll force the nose of the plane to the right or left, depending on which pedal the pilot presses with his foot to achieve smooth turns in the air, or counteract strong winds that cause turbulence, so the aircraft can stabilize. Operating the rudders located on the tail of the aircraft, especially during the kind of turbulence that rocks the plane from right to left, is already a tricky skill to learn under the best of circumstances. But an aircraft the size of an Airbus 300 is even more complex than usual. It has a much more powerful rudder, made up of 6 separate steel flaps, necessary for withstanding the extreme forces that come with bigger engines. It can take about 1,000 pounds of stress, which is much, much more than the rudders should have to face in any usual flight. With more power to withstand that kind of pressure comes more sensitivity to steering, too. Oversteering is a very real danger if a pilot overdoes the manual pump action with his feet. If the manual application isn't done just right, and the wind speeds that the rudder is up against is already high, a pilot could cause the rudders to experience more than their 1,000-pound stress limit. Unfortunately, in this case, Molen wasn't as experienced in working with manual rudders as he should have been. He had never received training for this particular facet of flying the A300. The National Transportation Board and the Allied Pilots Association were aware of the fact that specialized training was necessary for this oversensitive rudder control system, and they had been trying to make it a part of the standard pilot's annual training program since 1997. But the reviews and paperwork just hadn't gone through all the channels necessary to make it mandatory yet. So the airliner, the pilots, and most people overseeing Flight 587 just weren't aware of the dangers or the need for that kind of training, all thanks to drawn-out bureaucracy and paperwork that is notorious for taking much longer than it should be. At that moment, however, Molen had no reason to be nervous at all. The flight between JFK Airport in New York City and Las Americas International Airport in Santo Domingo, in the Dominican Republic, would only take 3.5 hours, if all went well. Looking at the weather, which only had clear skies ahead, it was almost a given that this would be a quick and uncomplicated flight for everyone on board. Most of the 251 passengers were flying over to the Dominican Republic to visit family. So 587 had an unusually large number of intact family, with infants and children getting ready to greet their cousins, aunts, and uncles waiting for them in Santo Domingo. Originally, the takeoff time was scheduled for 8:40, but due to all of the new security measures, Flight 587 only got to roll out on a runway 31L at 9 a.m., just behind a Boeing passenger plane heading for Japan. Molen and States receive a standard caution from the control tower to be prepared for some turbulence from the plane taking off ahead of them.
We'll be all right once we get rolling. He's supposed to be 5 miles by the time we're airborne. So you're happy? Yeah, like project complete on the roll.
The engines on a passenger plane are so powerful that the swirling air that trails behind the wings causes a disturbance in the air for up to 8 miles behind an aircraft of that size. This volatile airflow is called wake turbulence. 587 was at a safe distance behind the Japanese plane, but they were still within range of that turbulent airflow that it would leave behind. At a busy terminal like JFK Airport, pilots are trained to handle this kind of air traffic. They deal with it all the time. Quite frankly, air traffic control's warning was just standard procedure at this point. At 9:14, Molen starts the takeoff run when ATC gives him the all clear. Just 1 minute and 40 seconds after the Japanese Boeing ahead of them had left the runway. For the first minute or so, all goes well.
587 Heavy, turn left at a bridge time, and take a left departure. Good morning.
Hey, 587 Heavy, call. Gears up. Check speed, level change. Flaps up. Climb power.
The pilots update air traffic control on their steady climb to 3,000 feet. The ATC directs 587 to make a slight left turn to get them away from the runway's direction and onto their designated flight path. As you can hear, Molen complies with the instruction. no problem. But just as they make the turn, they hit that wake turbulence trailing behind the Japanese Boeing. Captain States even makes a brief comment about it. States sounds pretty calm about hitting the turbulence. He's experienced this kind of thing hundreds of times, and he's been expecting it. So was Mullen. He'd experienced his own share of wake turbulence too, and he automatically prepared to put the rudders to the use that they were intended for, to counteract the oncoming forces. The passengers, on the other hand, would have probably not been so relaxed about the sudden shaking and shuddering coming from their airborne ride. The force of those winds are like flying straight into a raging storm. First, the pilots adjust the speed to 250 knots, the maximum amount of thrust that they can apply during takeoff. The burst of speed is intended to straighten the plane, as well as giving it enough strength and speed to push through those combating winds. At roughly 3,000 feet off the ground, they hit another burst of even stronger winds, making the plane tilt in a pendulum motion. The passengers inside are now no longer experiencing a little shaking. They're being rocked from the right to the left like rag dolls inside their seats. Mullen finally makes use of the rudders to get them stable again. And here's where everything goes downhill fast. Keep up with us here. What happens next goes by in the blink of an eye. The shaking and weaving intensifies so much that the thumps and bangs are audible on the cockpit recordings, as the aircraft is being shaken like a cork. If you pay attention, you can catch those 3 thumping sounds through the static. States asks Mullen if he's alright, to which Mullen replies that he's fine. Suddenly, States gets worried and tells Mullen to hold on to it. It's almost certain that the shaking was now so intense that Mullen could no longer hold on to the yoke in his hands. States would have probably taken over control of the plane, but the next 10 seconds just went by too quickly for him to react before it was too late. Mullen started pumping the rudder pedals, and his lack of training, combined with Mullen's rising panic, caused him to overuse the rudders. Instead of stabilizing them, he's made them sway right and left so violently that the plane is weaving through the air like a paper plane at the end of its wind cruise. Just as States is about to grab the yoke himself, the violent shaking and weavings finally reached its peak. The cockpit starts blaring alarms. The passengers are screaming in panic. To us, this sounds like a bunch of noise and chaos, but to the residents of Bell Harbor, a neighborhood in the Rockaway Peninsula of Queens in New York City, there was no mystery about what was happening above them. Several witnesses heard the immense rumble and grinding of metal above their heads, and looked up to see a low-flying passenger plane weaving back and forth like a leaf in the tide. Then, the unthinkable happened. That wildly flying Airbus started falling apart in the sky. The tail fin breaks apart first, sending burning sheets of metal flying out behind 587 as it nosedives straight for the ground. Then goes the right engine just a split second afterwards, and now they're in a complete flat spin, gaining speed as they approach the ground. As they get nearer to the Earth's surface, the houses in its wake start to shake, the windows rattling so hard against their panes that several of them shatter to smithereens. Just like the bodies that were fighting for that particular rudder training had feared, an inexperienced pilot had finally oversteered and pushed the A300's rudder flaps over their 1,000-pound limit, causing the bolts holding them together to break into pieces. And when the tail shattered, it caused a chain reaction, tearing through the hull. And that was where the thumps and crashes on the cockpit recordings came from. It was the sound of the aircraft breaking apart and the air rushing into the cracks like a tidal wave. Down below, the few residents that saw the horrific sight of 587 breaking into pieces above their heads had no time to react. It was coming down too fast for anyone to do more than throw their hands over their heads to shield their faces. At 9:16, just 1 minute and 43 seconds after takeoff, Flight 587 connected with the neighborhood. The mushroom cloud of black smoke from the jet fuel bursting into flames was seen by other planes in the air, and those on land reported the smoke as far as 10 miles away from the crash site. Emergency services were bombarded with calls of hysterical citizens who were convinced that they'd been hit with an atomic bomb. This isn't much of an exaggeration. The entire neighborhood was ablaze, with the fire reaching temperatures so hot that firefighters had trouble getting in to look for survivors. Out on lawns were plane seats, with corpses still strapped into place, bodies and scattered limbs still on fire, or so damaged that only dental records and blood work would later be sufficient to identify everyone. The once tranquil little community now looked like the opening scene of an apocalypse movie. As you might have expected, when a plane falls from almost 2,000 feet straight down to the ground, the impact and colossal explosion that followed left no survivors. All 260 people on board, every man, woman, and child on that aircraft, perished on impact. But that's not the worst of it. Not even close. They crashed straight into a neighborhood full of people. The 4 homes that laid directly on the impact site were nothing more than a pile of cinders by the time the smoke cleared. The 5 houses opposite to them burned to the ground too, and dozens more houses suffered damage. Inside the 5 homes that were directly hit was a retired couple, Helen and Thomas Concannon, Kathy Lawler and her 24-year-old son Christopher, and 58-year-old Frank Pomponio, whose devoted golden retriever, Dakota, dug through the burning rubble to search for her owner until her paws were so burned that she couldn't walk. All in all, the final count of fatalities was 265, but the terror was just beginning. New York was convinced that another terror attack had hit them. The fleeing citizens of the neighborhood was nothing compared to the state of shock that New York City was in. Every capital or state-run building is evacuated. Bridges, tunnels, and airports were shut down, and all residents of New York were put on high alert. The lockdown lasted for 3 days while investigators collected the pieces. The neighborhood was built on a small peninsula surrounded by water, and the pieces that broke off in the air landed in the ocean. When they found the tail and saw the condition it was in, investigators called the alert off. There was no mistake that the tail was the location of the cause of the accident. The twisted metal indicated that the rudders were put under 3 times the amount of pressure that it was made to withstand. Even though the investigation took 2 years to complete, this long time to get to the end of it was not to figure out what caused the crash, it was to figure out who was to blame for it. In the end, it was decided that the design flaw in the A300 Airbus required specialized training. Mullen acted exactly as his usual training exercises taught him to, and not according to the method advised by the bodies that pushed for that training to be a part of the standard training. Airbus also shared some responsibility here. They were aware of the danger, given that there were multiple cases of oversteering that nearly caused other crashes in the past with this model. If they had issued an advised training program for it, or even just alerted the governing bodies of the previous incidents, then getting it authorized wouldn't have taken so long. Airbus argued that American Airlines was aware of the rudder sensitivity too, and they should have taken the steps to rectify the training for their own pilots. Predictably, the training was issued to every pilot before the next A300 took to the skies again, but that's too little too late. Nothing could bring back the 265 people that perished on that day, not to mention the grief and trauma that countless families across the United States and the Dominican Republic had to endure, where to this day memorial services are held annually to commemorate the most deadly aviation disaster in Airbus's history as a company. Never before had Airbus had such a devastating tragedy on their hands, and it was partially their fault. The crash of Flight 587 is the most deadly disaster in the history of aviation. Let's just hope that we don't get another, even worse loss of life anytime soon, because this one was so tragic that it nearly tore 2 countries to pieces.